Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Koshy, Director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's panel, Making It Plain, Articulating Our Racist Present. We are excited to have with us today some of the most thoughtful intersectional thinkers on contemporary racial justice struggles. Professors Roderick Ferguson, Mishuana Goeman, Viet Nguyen, and Alfonso Gonzales Toribio. Also joining me in moderating this event is my colleague, Professor Junaid Rana. In the interest of allowing as much time as possible for discussion, I will not be introducing our speakers individually, but you can find their detailed bios in the chat. This event is jointly organized by the Department of Asian American Studies and the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and it's funded by a grant through the University of Illinois Chancellor's Call to Action to address systemic racism and social injustice research program. This event is part of a year-long series of events called In Plain Sight, Reckoning with Anti-Asian Racism, which addresses historical and contemporary forms of anti-Asian racism alongside other racial justice struggles. Even though anti-Asian racism is not the central subject of this panel, it forms the ground of this conversation, shaping its structure and spirit. We wanted to begin the work of our initiative by setting up a wide-angle view of racism and anti-racist politics today. With that in mind, we've invited our four speakers to reflect comparatively and intersectionally about the frameworks we need now to think and act against racism. Each of our panelists will offer brief 10-minute reflections on 1 to 3 terms they believe are crucial for talking about racism now. Which keywords and questions do they think are indispensable to an analysis of our current moment? Following their presentations, the panelists will have some time to respond to each other before we open the discussion to the audience. For everyone in the audience, please use the Q&A feature, not the chat function, to type in your questions for the panelists. You simply click the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and enter in your questions. You can type in your questions at any time, but we will only be getting to them at the end of the presentations. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation, which feels so urgent and necessary. At a time when the sheer density of events makes reflection difficult, we hope this conversation offers some space for thinking and coming together. I'm going to now hand it over to our first speaker, Roderick Ferguson, who will kick off this event with his reflections.
All right, thank you. My thanks to Susan Koshy and also to Junaid Rana for this invitation, and also to my fellow panelists for this conversation. Even though I'll be talking about Black radical traditions, I hope their wide applicability to other racial formations becomes clear. All right, so the word that I've been turning over for some time now is the word fascism. So I'd like to engage that category through a specific speech that has meant a lot to me personally and intellectually. It's also a speech, I believe, that should speak to us historically as well, for past moments, but also for our present one. The speech that I'm talking about is the one that Toni Morrison gave at her and my alma mater, Howard University, in 1995. Now, the speech has been widely anthologized, most notably perhaps in the wonderful 2019 collection of her writings, The Source of Self-Regard, selected essays, speeches, and meditations, published just a few months before Morrison's death. In that collection, we find the speech entitled Racism and Fascism. Here, Morrison tries to rechart the history of fascism away from a comparison with Germany, Italy, and Japan, and towards the macro and micro instances that help to build fascist orders. That version of the speech begins, quote, "Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, and even a third. end quote. Morrison recounts some of those steps in the speech. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion, pathologize the enemy in scholarly and popular mediums, criminalize the enemy, then prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males, and absolutely its children, and so on. Morrison's speech responded to the proposals that were coming from conservative sectors. Recall that the then leader of the Republican Party, Newt Gingrich, issued the 1994 Contract with America, which recommended that Black children of unfit parents be taken away and put in orphanages. These demonizing constructions and others like them for Morrison helped to lay the foundation for fascism within the US, defining it, she said, quote, fascism is recognizable by its determination to convert all public services to private entrepreneurship, all nonprofit organizations to profit-making ones, so that the narrow but protective chasm between governance and business disappears. It changes parenting into panicking so that we vote against the interests of our own children, against their healthcare, their education, their safety from weapons, end quote. We may situate Morrison's remarks within a long history of Black radical thinkers from Ida B. Wells, C.L.R. James, M.A. Césaire, Angela Davis, Cedric Robinson, and so on. People who insisted that anti-Black racism and racism in general are functions of fascist formations. In the words of the theorist Alberto Toscano, quote, attending to the long history of Black radical thinking about fascism and anti-fascist resistance to what Cedric Robinson called a Black construction of fascism, alternative to the historical manufacture of fascism of Western Geist, could serve to dislodge the debate about fascism from the deadlock of analogy, providing the resources to confront our volitive interregnum, end quote. It is precisely our violent interregnum, end quote. It is precisely with an eye toward the resources that we need to confront our violent interregnum that I would like to now turn from the 2019 version of the speech to the original version from 1995. The 2008 volume, Toni Morrison, What Moves at the Margin, Selected Nonfiction, published the original in its entirety. The volume's version is entitled Remarks Given at the Howard University Charter Day Convocation. After giving her thanks to the university's administration, Morrison begins significantly, quote, Howard University, both as an institution and as a population, has had an extraordinary journey. It entered the world in an interventionist mode and has continued throughout its history to engage with debate and respond to the most salient, the most passionately held, and the most urgent issues of this nation, end quote. Morrison goes on to say, quote, Howard countered with vengeance the prevailing 19th century notion that education was not part of the future of African Americans. Evidence to the contrary is overwhelming, and the nation owes Howard University a great deal in terms of the countering of that 19th century notion, end quote. In terms of what these interventions meant for the political and liberatory ethos of this nation, Morrison continues, quote, members of the Howard community went right on disassembling these arguments and positions in order to become the leader in the early civil rights movement, end quote. While the 2019 version of the speech begins with the problems of racism and fascism, the speech in its original form begins with the alternative. And in doing so, it presents a story in which fascism is not without opposition, but is dogged by people and institutions that will resist it. As the original speech makes clear, Howard and the nation are called to action because of the worrisome developments of that time. As Morrison said, quote, I have profoundly pleasant and exciting memories of this place, but I am listing the more sinewy of these impressions because they are the ones that represent aspects of knowledge and features of resilience very much in demand right now, end quote. The original speech provided not only fascism's description, but also its antidote, one that involves sustaining and building critical and interventionist institutions and subjectivities. This week, 17 HBCUs received bomb threats. Given the history of this country and character of our present moment, this is both horrifying and unremarkable. Morrison's 1994 address provides a diagnosis of this week's events and a recommendation for how HBCUs can activate historical and ancestral traditions and resources to come through another valley filled with dangers, toils, and snares. It is also an invitation for other institutions to take inspiration from and note of schools like Howard, Morgan, Spelman, Jackson State, Tougaloo, and so on. To deal with fascism, we need only immerse ourselves in the intellectual and political wealth all around us. Thank you.
Nawasikan, everybody. I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to join my colleagues here today. The two words that I chose were relationality and scale to think of in terms of confronting racism, confronting the fascism, as Rod just talked about, Professor Ferguson, in that there's needs to be an antidote for how we relate and work together, particularly as research is ongoing. So in thinking through these approaches, I think of Eileen Moreton Robinson, who Aboriginal woman, who explains that, quote, relationality forms the conditions of possibility for coming to know and producing knowledge through research in a given time, place, and land. Relationality is grounded in a holistic conception of the interconnectedness and intersubstantiation between and among all living things in the earth, which is inhabited by a world of ancestors and creator beings. I like this. It kind of works with what Rod was just saying about our ancestors and that being very much a formative part of how we have to deal with the present moment. It informs our epistemological and ethical premise that social research should begin with an awareness of our proper relationships to the world we inhabit and is conducted with respect, responsibility, generosity, obligation, and reciprocity. And it's the reciprocity that I have felt so fortunate in my life in doing and working in ethnic studies or working across different groups, particularly in feminism and gender studies, that reciprocity I have felt to be the most vibrant and beautiful parts of the work that I've done in the academy. Which often, as we all know, can be hostile and not so beautiful at times. So when I think of how to move forward or what this moment might recall, I also think of a good way of life or a good mind is what we call it in Haudenosaunee philosophy, where the actions you take think forward to future generations. The action you take in your research now, even, or in how we approach racism, also has a future aspect of thinking forward, either 7 generations from now, but also that it's done without anger and grief and those sorts of elements. It's done with a balance of mind or a good mind in that particular way. This is a good way of life that is considered to be one which promotes the continuation of life for all living beings. That is, it can get us out of the scope where what we've seen during this time of COVID, where some are left let die in those particular words. But relationality becomes the way that we can think of how to relate together. Relationality is not singularly linked just to knowledge production here either, and I want to make that clear. It also describes a way of relating to each other in a broader sense. Such as when it becomes synonymous with kinship, and kinship not in a nuclear family or that sort of European fashion of which the family becomes an apparatus from which to only care about your immediate family or to create families of race, and that's all that matters in that. But kinship can be a larger process of relationality, where as Daniel Heath Justice defines kinship broadly as an active network of connections, a process of continual acknowledgement and enactment. And it's the enactment part that we need to see more, I believe, as we move forward for solutions to anti-racism. In this way, relationships between people, Black, Indigenous, Asian, is not mired also in settler temporalities. Too often I see divisions between people occur because we do have different pasts. We do have different ways that we all came to share that common ground that relationality supposes. It is not about who has the worst past or a past of oppression too, right? But how do we also move forward together, and how do we account for that past in those spaces? And how do we account for those fissures which may never be, which may never work out, which may have some points where we might not be looking towards the same future, but how can we support each other in those futures where we can work together? That, and not in a kumbaya way either. I think these conversations are incredibly difficult, but I think the path forward is also having that respect and reciprocity, that generosity. So how has the structural then informed our understanding of relating to each other? I believe here that relationality helps us to build across different components, especially if we take that heart that relationality is about the living for creating a good life for all living relations, the human and the more than human. So as Leanne Simpson says, she says, my nationhood doesn't just radiate outward, it also radiates inwards. It is my physical body, my mind, my spirit. It is our families, not the nuclear family that has been normalized in settler society, but big, beautiful, diverse, extended, multiracial families of relatives and friends that care deeply for each other. So here I see some of the best work in anti-racist coalitions and such being feminist practices of care. And I believe that like whether it's Sandy Grande, who talks about what do our elsewhere futures work with for our elders, or those feminist practices of care that I feel Black women have been taking as they deal with COVID, or even the feminist practices of care that I'm going to relate to in Manson Are Diverted by Anne Kanako, who Japanese filmmaker, who did a wonderful example of how we begin to take relationality seriously in addressing past that seemingly, or histories that seemingly don't cohere. As we think about the structures of our current state, and how they not only cause violence on the interpersonal scale or in our specific communities, but also at various other scales that are larger, we also can think about the intentionality of that. They are meant to do so in a white supremacist architecture. They are meant to keep us apart. I'm giving a talk next week in sharing an image of a quilt that my aunt made during Black Lives Matter's work, and thinking about our Haudenosaunee communities and how sovereignty in Buffalo became that center for the Underground Railroad in terms of going to Canada, and how our sovereignty was used there. It's a beautiful quilt that I highly suggest to look at. But these are histories where we do touch upon each other, where there is a relationality that becomes intentional. So part of that intentionality that occurs in that building of a structure that's meant to pull apart how we interact with each other is alienation from land that has led to, I think, increasing disparities between groups of people. Um, but biopic people have communities are at the forefront of the destruction and have been for years. And so one of the questions that relationality raises also, as climate increases, it is helpful to think about strategies that address our relationality in the past and the present. So for example, the beautiful film, I'm just gonna read a little description from Manzanar Diverted says, from the majestic peaks of the snow-capped Sierras to the parched valley of Painhanda, the land of flowing water, Manzanar Diverted, when water becomes dust, poetically weaves together memories of intergenerational woman, Native Americans, Japanese American from World War II, incarcerees, and environmentalists form an unexpected alliance to defend their land and water from Los Angeles. So I bring this beautiful film up because Kathy Bancroft was also one of the tribal elders in the film, but we also heard through the historic footage, et cetera, of what that activism around saving Manzanar as a pilgrimage site or as a museum site meant also at that particular time, as a recognition of how those two paths come together, but also a recognition how the infrastructure, the water infrastructure and the stealing of water remains today for the Paiute and causes a climate disaster that's existing. But to put those together in a practice of care and relationality that the director did, I think that's where we can, just to provide an example of where I see anti-racism needing to go in those practices. So what I love about the way that the conversation presents itself as it's one of mutual respect, understanding how the multiple removals, from the removal of the Paiute to the fort, from the Japanese, from the Los Angeles landscape, and how that helps then in turn develop and gentrify Japanese areas. But the removal of Japanese people to that 1 square mile infrastructure at Manzanar all becomes militarization zones as well. Los Angeles, an international city on the land of Tovangar, remains the point of these conversations also. So she just does an amazing job connecting through water and land and the relationality and recognizing how the theft of land and water, or our alienation from it, such as what happened to the Japanese internments, is all part of how to confront that anti-racism. So as Native American and Indigenous studies grows and becomes a burgeoning field, there has also been kind of a little bit of a groundswell even by people that we may supposedly naturally align with, biopic people, of a pushback against Indigenous studies as it is labeled too narrow or not international enough. And its focus is too small on just America or Canada or even our individual small communities. These are all mechanisms used to diminish what little resources that we might have, but I feel that this is promoted through the structure of universities and scarcity politics, right? And so this is part of that ongoing structure of that alienation and that alienation from each other. So rather, I encourage us to think, in the words of Jody Bird, emphasize relationality rather than a comparison model, which is too often done in kind of anti-racist politics. So I see in relationality, the land and water that does connect us. So when I teach on development, for instance, of nuclear power, I also speak to imperialism on an international scale. There's nothing small, too small or narrow or too North American or non-international about that, right? I trace the footpath of nuclear development from the mining at Laguna Pueblo, which caused high rates of cancer, to Bikini Island. I pull in Teresia Tioa's work to think about what that means, the place of immense climate upheaval right now. Here I'm also able to then trace it back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and imperialism and the threat of the Cold War, all the way back to Shoshone landscape in Nevada, which is the #1 nuclear bomb place in the world. So there's nothing too small about Indigenous studies. There's ways that we can relate. If we think the relationality and the concepts of land, we're all touched by that first uranium. Our bodies are at the scale of our bodies have changed because of that, all the way to the scale of our ocean water, all the way to the scale of the political and economic climates that we work from. The settler colonialism in the United States has caused an arena and a power for the US and Canada, I never let Canada off the hook, to become these powers that amass destruction on a worldwide level. So for me, I think if we think about relationality and scales in these particular ways, we can see that the ravishing of water and land is international, and our struggles are key to understanding militarization from PI islands to the lands of the Shoshone to a global scale, and policies of economics it upholds as well on that global scale. So thank you. I'll just kind of end with that.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists on this important event. I'm going to be talking about 3 keywords today: decolonization, solidarity, and self-critique. And I'll be talking about them in an autobiographical way because my career as a scholar, fiction writer, essayist, and forthcoming memoirist have been deeply influenced by my autobiography and my lived experiences. I have no desire to deny the impact of my autobiography on my work. So basically, I'm a Vietnamese refugee from the war in Vietnam, came to the United States as a young person, and grew up, having your typically deracinated Asian American experience, which is to say, I knew I was Asian, didn't know what to call myself until I went to Berkeley and was immediately radicalized by people like you on my panel. And of course, what I discovered was that I was an Asian American, discovered all of this history of anti-Asian racism and progressive Asian American struggle and so on and so forth. And it was enormously empowering for me and set me on the path to this panel today. But back then, I decided not to become an Asian American studies major. I became an ethnic studies major at Berkeley because I felt even intuitively at that time that what was really crucial was not only an understanding of my particular history, but how to locate that in relationship, as Mishuana has argued, in relationship to other groups, both other so-called marginalized or minority groups within the United States, but also internationally as well in the context of anti-colonial struggles. So that's where this term decolonization comes in, because in fact, for Asian Americans, I think oftentimes, and this is true for me at this earlier stage of my life, we're conditioned, we're encouraged to think about our experiences purely in racial terms, in terms of diversity, in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of the empowerment of our groups, and not in terms of the questions of colonization and decolonization. But the more I thought about the Vietnam War, the fundamental event of my life that shaped me and my family, the more I realized that it was not simply a war or an isolated war or even an American war. But if we were to take it from an American context, it was simply one episode in a much longer history of American warfare that goes back to the very origins of what we call the United States. And so, the part of the way that I think that we as so-called minorities are encouraged to think about ourselves is precisely to isolate ourselves from relationality. An understanding of our histories are linked to the histories of other groups and to the fundamental history of the United States. So my own thinking about the Vietnam War, as reflected in my scholarly and fictional writing, has been to argue and to depict it as a war that takes place in a much longer history of colonization, with the French coming to Vietnam, the Americans taking over, and so on. And that therefore the existence of a Vietnamese diaspora, a Vietnamese refugee population in the United States cannot be understood purely in the terms of identity politics or minority rights or multiculturalism, but has to be understood in this continuity of colonization, of which racism is a very, very fundamental part, but so are things like warfare and conquest and genocide and slavery. And if we understand that experience in that way, then for those of us who are Vietnamese or Asian Americans, we have to locate our experiences relative to other groups and also relative, again, not just to racial empowerment struggles or anti-racism or even specifically anti-Asian racism, but colonization. So that we have to understand how anti-Asian acts of violence that have been taking place over the last couple of years are not simply directed at us individually or somehow a contemporary manifestation or even a continuation of a long history of anti-Asian violence in this country, that these acts of anti-Asian violence are in fact related to the anti-Asian acts of violence that constitute American wars in Asia. Those were the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence that the United States has been involved in. And there's a direct continuity between these American wars in Asia and anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian exploitation happening in the United States. So to think about ourselves and our struggles as Asian Americans and as Vietnamese Americans through decolonization is both daunting because it increases the scale of our political horizon and our struggle, but it also, I think, empowers as we understand how our struggles are related to others. So I'll give you another concrete example of that, which is that when George Floyd was murdered, one of the quotes that I saw circulating around on the internet quite often was this quote from Frantz Fanon. "We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe," he supposedly wrote in Black Skin, White Masks. If you actually go back to Black Skin, White Masks and read the original French or even the English translation, what he actually wrote was that it is not because the Indo-Chinese discovered his own culture that he revolted. It is because, quite simply, it was, in more ways than one, becoming impossible for him to breathe. So Fanon, writing in the 1950s, was referring to the Indo-Chinese struggle against French colonization. And again, it was not a cultural issue. It was a matter of colonization, decolonization, violent struggle, and so on and so forth. So he was already at that moment linking these issues of global Black diaspora, global Black revolution, and anti-colonial Vietnamese Indo-Chinese revolution as well. And 30 to 40 years before Fanon was writing, Ho Chi Minh was making the same argument that in fact the struggles of the Indo-Chinese and of Black Africans who were being colonized by the French were one and the same kind of struggle as he sought to develop and build a global anti-colonial revolutionary movement. So, you know, that context of solidarity is really crucial. Solidarity both in terms of multiracial and cross-racial alliances and so forth, but also international struggle as well. If we take colonization and decolonization as our framework, of course we have to focus on the local and the national, but we also have to understand that colonization itself has been global, and therefore any kind of resistance to colonization has to be global in its efforts for solidarity as well. So then we turn to self-critique, because I think decolonization and solidarity, these kinds of keywords are probably very amenable to the audience that we have, right? We're fighting a progressive cause against all kinds of various oppressions. We understand that. What about self-critique? You know, to me, self-critique is absolutely crucial in any kind of political struggle, because in fact, it's easy to criticize dominant power. It's easy to criticize white supremacy. It's not easy, but it's easier to criticize our opponents, our enemies, the ideological forces that we see arrayed against us. What about criticizing ourselves? It's a lot harder for just about everybody. And yet myself as a novelist and as a memoirist, I have no choice but to engage in self-critique and in self-reflection. So in my own work, I subject myself to a lot of critique, but I also subject my allies, my friends, the populations that I come from to self-critique as well. So my first book, Race and Resistance, Asian American Literature and Politics, 2002, kind of unpopular with some Asian American people, studies people, because at the time, I think the dominant position within Asian American studies is that we're radical, we're oppressed, and Asian American culture is automatically oppositional. I disagree with that. I think it can be oppositional, it should be oppositional, but in fact, back in 2002, I argue we see a lot of neoconservatives in the Asian American communities. How do we discuss them? Now, I think that point is, I don't know how to say it, but I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, we look out at a much more diversified array of Asian American politics right now, where we see Asian Americans on the far left, we see Asian Americans on the far right, and we see Asian Americans in the liberal middle. So there is no way by which we could conclude that there's a sort of homogenous Asian American oppositionalism happening out there. How do we therefore discuss Asian American culture and politics? And even around the question of anti-Asian racism, we have to be engaged in self-critique, because there are a lot of Asian Americans out there who I do not think are invested in decolonization, in solidarity, in relationality, in seeing themselves as part of a settler colonial state. And instead, they're deeply invested in, even as liberals, in a settler colonial state and in the politics of the military industrial complex. And so we who are Vietnamese or Asian American, progressives or radicals and so on, we have to be capable of criticizing our own peoples and our own populations. And I'll end with talking about Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese refugees and myself. When Vietnamese refugees came here, when I came here with my family, we were settled in a place called Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And for most of my life, I never thought twice about what that meant. But of course, on doing a little bit of research, what I discovered is that Fort Indiantown Gap was built by white settlers in Pennsylvania to ostensibly defend themselves against the native populations of the area. Of course, really, to wage war against the native populations of those areas. Well, when the United States and when American soldiers came to Vietnam and they built their fire bases, they called the territory around their fire bases Indian country. So in the American imagination, we Vietnamese were the Indians, and then when we came to the United States, we were part of the settler colonial apparatus. Now that kind of contradiction is really confusing, but also really productive for critique and politics. And I think it's something that Vietnamese American studies is increasingly moving towards, especially in the work of someone like Evan Lea Espiritu Gandhi. But the question of Vietnamese investment in colonization is not purely a US issue. It's also a Vietnamese issue, as in Vietnam, because while we here in the United States are so-called minority, in Vietnam, Vietnamese people like me are the majority, right? And in fact, Vietnam as a nation, from my understanding, has been built on imperialism and settler colonization, in which I myself, as a member of this majority, is invested in. Now, when you ask Vietnamese people about colonization, what they will say immediately is we were colonized by China for 1,000 years, and then the French came and the Americans came. But very few Vietnamese people will bring up, hey, we colonized a lot of people ourselves. Half of Vietnam is taken by military conquest from the Cham and the Cambodians. So that kind of complexity in terms of understanding the ways that power, domination, oppression are multiple and contradictory, and that we might find ourselves in complicated nexuses of contradictions is absolutely necessary to recognize if we are to engage in this kind of what I hope to be a utopian struggle, not just a struggle against white supremacy, but a struggle against the white supremacy within ourselves. I'll just speak about myself in this case and not about everybody else. But that kind of self-critique is, I think, absolutely necessary to anti-racist and decolonizing struggles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nguyen. That was wonderful. Really, I think I'm gonna complement with what I'm gonna talk about here. So I'm Alfonso Gonzales Toribio. I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program at UCR, and I was asked to give three terms in response to the question of overcoming racism today. And for me, I think that requires a discussion of one, neoliberal capitalism, and two, its ever more brutal social forms, and three, I just wanted to make some points about anti-communism and the specter of China. I think is really important for talking about anti-Asian racism, but I think in general, race, politics, immigration, refugees, and global power in general. So the first thing I want to say is, I think any discussion of overcoming racism has to move beyond theories of race and racism that isolate the category of race from the broader social and historical totality. Broader social and historical totality. Too often in academia, we have scholars that only want to talk about their particular racial or ethnic group, their particular oppression. I think that's necessary in certain moments and certain occasions, but we can't isolate race from the broader social historical processes. As Professor Nguyen was saying, much of this is linked to the process of decolonization, colonization, but I would take it a step further and say this is a problem of modernity. Modernity is what brings about the expansion of capitalism through colonialism. It's what brings about the coming together of the world through force, and it's what makes the experience in Vietnam, in Algeria, in Mexico, in Cambodia, in El Salvador, a part of a broader history of the expansion of capitalism from Western Europe throughout the globe. And I think if we start to think about race as part of these broader social and historical totalities, we can go beyond, as part of a broader social and historical totality, we can go beyond simply being in dialogue with ourselves, right? We're in a very critical moment in world politics in which if we don't begin talking about how to overcome contemporary neoliberalism and the ever more brutal social forms that it's produced, then I think that we're all going to be in a very difficult position. So what do I mean by the ever more brutal social forms of contemporary neoliberalism? Well, that requires that we understand what we mean by neoliberalism. Neoliberal capitalism, to be precise, right? It's a particular historic moment in capitalism that is undoing the post-World War II social order. What is the post-World War II social order? The founding of the Bretton Woods institutions, the founding of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1951 Refugee Convention. As imperfect as these documents were and are, they set a framework in which many groups throughout the world, starting with the Black and Mexican American, Native American movements here in the United States, began to articulate their particular rights struggles. The Black civil rights movement, the Mexican American civil rights movement, etc. These movements are started by Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans coming back from World War II. And they're using the dominant rights regimes that come after the World War II order to make their rights claims. Okay, well, that particular historic formation following World War II was made possible by Fordist capitalism or Keynesian economics, right? That's a different type of social organization that is different than neoliberal capitalism. And there was a material basis for sustaining a certain standard of living in the United States, even for Mexican Americans and African Americans, for example. Well, what neoliberalism has done, it has dismantled the Keynesian and Fordist social order. And now we have a very brutal social order in which we've undone the social safety net. We have a very brutal social order in which that's beginning to resemble 19th century capitalism. Remember, it's in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century or the 1870s, that we get the work of Sir Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics. This is the age of imperialism in the late 19th century, in which the British and other European powers are colonizing in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas. And they begin to come out with these ideas around scientific racism. Well, scientific racism through the study of eugenics, founded by Galton, is making a comeback in the 21st century. To give you an example, under the Trump administration, many of his immigration advisors were inspired by the neo-eugenicist writings of a man named John Tanton. In these types of politics that in the post-World War II area were looked down upon because their association with the Nazis, have now reemerged in the 21st century as dominant tropes organizing the logic of the racial politics coming from the far right. There's another element to eugenics in that it's, Sir Francis Galton was the cousin of, I'm drawing a blank here. Survival of the Fittest. Sir Francis Galton was inspired by the writings of forgetting the name of his first cousin. Why am I forgetting this? I don't know why. But basically, eugenics posits the idea that certain groups are racially superior to other racial groups, of course, with Europeans being on top. Well, that type of racial politics emerges at the end of the 19th century, and it's back at the 21st century. Why is it making a comeback in the 21st century? Because in order for capitalism to survive, it must undo with the type of mainstream liberal Darwin. Thank you. Someone pointed. Sir Francis Galton was the first cousin of Charles Darwin. But in order for capitalism to survive in the 21st century, it must undo not just the Fordist social order, but also undo the post-World War II social order that was try to create a system for preventing the world from going to war because of the contradictions of the long 19th century. We had two world wars, World War I and World War II. And the whole reason for the Bretton Woods institutions following World War II is to try to manage global affairs in the face of capitalism that resulted in imperialist wars, colonization and decolonization. So here we are in the 21st century, in which eugenics has made a comeback, which the politics of race seems to be once again one of the dominant features for explaining the way capitalism is managed and survives through divide and conquer of different racial groups. And here we are in a moment where the global politics seem to be up for grabs. We only need to look at what's happening in Ukraine with the situation with Russia, NATO, Russia over Ukraine. And then we think of, I wanted to bring up a point about China. Currently, because neoliberal capitalism is in crisis, it has to reproduce itself, and it has to reproduce itself, and it has to expand. One of the greatest forces in opposition or threats to US hegemony, which is the defender of global capitalism, is China. And this is in no way a defense of China. I'm not here to condone or condemn China, but I just want to say that in the American imaginary, China is a force to be reckoned with. I, for one, don't know a lot about China, but my recent thinking on China is actually inspired by a graduate student that I'm working with named Alejandro Prado, who's writing about the role of Chinese capital in Southern California in relation to Latinos. And it's actually opened my eyes to a broader literature about the role of China in Africa, the role of China in Latin America, which I've heard out through other mechanisms. And I think that as long as China is a major part or a threat to US hegemony or a world force that can compete with US hegemony at this time when neoliberalism is in crisis, that we're going to continue to see anti-Asian racism. We're going to particularly focus on the Chinese. And of course, that will be applied to other Asian groups. And it's going to be an organizing logic in the 21st century, precisely because China is one of the most powerful global forces that can compete with US hegemony. And there's a long history of anti-Chinese racism in the United States, especially in the 19th century. And we're at a moment in which that will continue to be relevant. And I think we have to think about how our diverse subjectivities connect to this broader history, not just of anti-Asian racism, but to capitalist modernity, the expansion of capital, the displacement of people, and the use of race as a dominant organizing logic in politics in the United States. Well, those are my general comments, and I look forward to discussion with the rest of the colleagues.
Thank you all for your comments. This is a rich set of ideas and concepts for us to build on. So now we have about 40 minutes for discussion. What we'll start with is I will prompt our speakers a little bit in terms of moderating a conversation amongst ourselves as we sort of settle and think through possible questions for those of you in the audience. We will be using the Q&A function. So if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A section and I will be reading it out to our panelists. But to begin with, one of the things that I noticed in all of your presentations today was sort of where many of you ended, which was the point of critique. It's both analytic, and in some ways it is the answer or a kind of response in terms of a way forward, whether, in Rod's sort of thinking of critical institutions, reading that through Toni Morrison, or an interventionist approach, whether through Mishuana's multiple layers of critique, whether it's indigenous critique, feminist critique, even thinking through relationality as critique, Viet's idea of self-critique, but also a critical awareness of both what we might look at in terms of like our placement within history, where we are, how do we analyze our situation, and some of the sort of ideas in terms of what Alfonso shared in terms of critique of neoliberal capitalism, or even, if we want to call it that, anti-capitalism. So I'm curious how all of you are thinking of this as both analysis and perhaps solidarity, perhaps a kind of action, right? In the sense of, what does that mean? So perhaps we can open it to everyone, or whoever wants to go first.
Okay, maybe I'll go first, just to start things off. Yeah, I mean, absolutely that. I think that for me, I go to the Morrison, but also that history, or the way in which she narrates the history of Howard, because both are going on at the same time for me in terms of analysis, but also, a kind of incitement to alternative subject institutional formations, so that the analysis has as its endpoint, the sort of what kinds of institutions do we want or are required? What kinds of subjectivities are needed, to combat, a historical urgency? And so for me, it is the question of, what kinds of alternative institutional modes can be brought into being, and are implied by a critique.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to two. I'm sorry, were you done, Professor? I want to go to 2 points that Professor Nguyen made. I think that's around conservative people of color, particularly. You mentioned conservative Asians, but we got to put on the table conservative Latinos that very much do identify with the type of authoritarian responses to social problems. So homelessness, lock them up, throw them, put them in jail. Refugees, let's turn our back on them. Even if you point out, hey, your parents were immigrants, they came with no documents. Yeah, but they were different, right? That's all part of the authoritarian response that's a contemporary neoliberalism that makes us only connect with our individual needs, and that's it, right? So it's hyper individualism disconnects us from our particular historical trajectories, and it makes impossible, or it makes it difficult to find solidarity with Blacks or with Asians or with other groups, right? So this is not just a problem of self-hate. This is a problem of the mode of capitalist production producing particular types of subjectivities that are not radical, that are anti-democratic, that are authoritarian in nature. So I think that type of critique of our own communities is important. And I think, if you would have asked me this question 5 years ago, I would say, well, we need more organizing. We need more Black and Latino organizing, coalitions, which I think there's some of that, but I think we need a lot of more critical thinking, right? Because the ideas, our organizing, our politicians, our spokespeople in our communities, they're only as good as the ideas that they're fighting for. And if their ideas are ultimately rooted in a type of neoliberal politics that commodifies our identities, but doesn't really have a critique of capital or is incapable of presenting alternatives, then I don't think we just need more activism. We need more critical thinking. For me, organizing and activism is important, but it has to depart from a particular type of critique. in order to actually make social change.
I guess I'll pipe in here too, is that I actually finding a common set of goals, right, that people can come in and out of, or just being on the ground doing the work. I think where I've had to hash out concepts of property, for instance, right? And just let's just talk about, like, I do a lot of on the ground community work lately, like going to the gardens and actually planting and getting my hands dirty, right? Like I feel like that's part of what I have to do if I'm thinking about land and relationality, and how to, well, not right now because I'm in Maine and the ground's frozen, but when I'm in California, which I miss dearly right now, I get out there and I go and I garden. I think about the water. I, clean the muck out of the ponds. All of that kind of work. And that's where I've had the best conversations with people that do have more ideas of, what is this land back thing, even while they're there working on a site that potentially could be considered land back, but they're thinking of it in kind of property logics in that particular way. But that, when I find like we're both in that common goal of like cleaning up a place or doing something, right? Or Little Tokyo, when I've done some work with the Western Arts Alliance and things like that in those tours, or talking with people how to create relationships between Native groups and other groups, right? Whatever the project is that I'm doing, I find that it's around project bases and actually doing something when that relationality comes back, that kind of that activeness around it, not just the critical analysis, but trying to work towards that. And that's when you can see some of the fissures come up. So for instance, with the land back thing, that there's somebody who I respect and admire deeply, but they're like, well, what are we going to do? I mean, do we just fall into these property logics? I mean, people are just, pie in the sky thinking that they're going to get their land back. But then we're there getting the land back every little tiny piece at a time, so that you can imagine deeper possibilities later on, right? And imagine possibilities that aren't encapsulated and contained in private property logics or neoliberalism or anything like that. Like I see the way that people interact around certain projects. I really love Manzanar Diverted, because that is the project that came together, that pilgrimage site to save that, not to put another military base there. That was something that had to have that imagination and that activeness. It had to have hard conversations between the Paiute and the Japanese, the people that were interred in that public directors committee. I highly recommend Wendy Yamashita's work, who talks about that and those possibilities. But I think it's like when you work on projects together and get your hands dirty, that's when things really begin to manifest themselves. And I guess that's why I always look at, you have to have the theoretical to kind of envision. And here I think of Helena Maria Veramontes' work when she talks about the making of Nopalitas. You have to have that imagination, that beauty, which I loved that you talked about with the memoir, right? The idea of fiction, because you have to address the self-critique there. But when I think about Helena Maria Veramontes' work, when she talks about needing that imagination and that theory to peek beyond the fences of your own reality to see a future, I think that's what we need, that self-critique. But then we also need to just sit down and do the work together. I think of what happened in Flint with the water supplies being contaminated between Black and Indigenous communities, right? There might be, kind of some antagonisms going on in academia, but when you have a project where people want clean water and they want clean water for their children, you do come together as, in that case, Anishinaabe and Black communities came together, the people that were relocated to Detroit, which was a relocation center in the 1950s for the capitalist project, but also Black people were located there too, and we live in those same neighborhoods. Those are the projects that on the ground matter, because you're protecting your children, you want clean water, you want land, you want that which is life, right? And I think that's the possibilities that can exist in these particular moments for solidarity practices and such. I don't know, I'll stop there.
And I'll jump in. I think that, critique is a form of action. It's not the only kind of action, obviously, but it is a form of action. And obviously all of us are engaged in that kind of critique in our various scholarly ways, in our pedagogy, I assume too. And so, of course, critique has been important to get us to this point, in having this kind of a conversation, to having our sense of ethnic studies, for example, if that's what we do, change over time over the last 30 years that I've been involved in it through both critique and self-critique. But, both Rod and Mishuana bring up the role of critique in the form of art, first with Toni Morrison, for example, and then with Elena Maria Viramontes. Now with Toni Morrison, of course, she was a brilliant critical thinker in the non-fictional sense, but we listen to her because of her novels as art, and her novels as a form of critique as well. And so that idea of the imagination, the artistic imagination, as being a place where critique is carried out, that Mishuana gestured at, I think is absolutely crucial. I don't know if there are any artists or writers or so on out there in the audience today, but that work that creative people do is also crucial to all the various keywords that have been brought up by the panelists today. So I just reserve a space for art as a form of critique and action too.
Great, that's some excellent points. Let me remind the audience, as we continue on, please do post your questions. And so at this moment, I'll turn to reading some questions as they've come out. They are for specific participants. So the first one coming from Chris Freeberg. This question is for Professor Ferguson. I really enjoyed the talk. Did anything in your experience as a student at Howard shape the terms you chose to discuss today? If not, could you explain more about what is compelling to you about Morrison and Howard for today's talk? I'll just read the three that we have, and then we can go in that order. This is from Maya Crystal. What do you think is the best way to go about understanding our relationality and scholarship when there are so many different areas of scholarship and different histories? And I think the whole panel can respond to that one. And then we also have a question from Xiomara Cervantes Gomez. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful reflections and entry points into these conversations. I have a question for Dr. Gonzales Toribio. I'm fascinated that you reminded us of the trace of eugenics into our historical present. I'm also a Mexicanist, so forgive me for such a selfish question, but could you perhaps elaborate on the implications of the eugenics enterprise in the times of neoliberal capitalism from a Latin American perspective that always has an intimate relationship with the US's own state building project? And as we well know from the 60s onward, this relationship, excuse me, really isn't new. But I guess I'm asking, what's the relationship between death politics and eugenics, and how that interfaces with neoliberal capitalism and its adjacents, such as Sayak Valencia's Gore capitalism? So maybe we can start with those three, and then I'll keep reading. There's a number of other questions.
Okay, so the question was, did any of the experiences that I had as a student at Howard have to do with the terms that I chose? Absolutely. So I chose fascism. I guess the implicit term also was alternative, or terms were alternative and resistance. So just to give you a sense of my undergraduate years at Howard, my first year as an undergraduate in an African-American studies, African-American history course, Sweet Honey in the Rock came to the course and performed. And so that was my first encounter with the Black woman a cappella singing group led by and started by the former SNCC Freedom singer, Bernice Johnson Reagan, also a historian, also a Howard graduate. My second year at Howard is when I heard Toni K. Bambara speak before she died. Also that year, Bell Hooks and Cornel West came, to give joint addresses. It's also the first time that I heard the category environmental racism from a friend of mine, Maisha. This is in 1992. She also introduced me to the work of Robert Bullard. I remember seeing Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael coming out of one of the buildings in arts and sciences. So, very much or Black radical traditions were just all around me as a student at Howard. And also the sense that we were in urgent and dangerous times, and that we as students had to figure out some way of showing up, for those times. And so very much so part of my experience as a student at Howard.
I'd like to take a shot at the relationality question since it came next, but I think for me, on the question of relationality and other kinds of subjects in which other than what I was trained to deal with, what I've benefited a lot from is, first of all, recognizing that I have blind spots, many, many, many blind spots. My training was in ethnic studies, so of course the question of race and Asian Americans was foregrounded, along with the question of interracial solidarities with African American studies, Chicano studies, and Native American studies. But I had to confront, over the course of time, my blind spots around feminism, around queer studies, around the question of settler colonialism. These have all been sort of major points in my own intellectual trajectory. So I think it's necessary for, again, when it comes to self-critique, to recognize, to try to figure out what our blind spots are. Now it's hard, because how do you see what a blind spot is? By definition, it's going to be invisible to you. So part of that work, I think, has to involve exposing ourselves to other forms of study that may not seem relevant to us in the first place. So my trajectory from doing work on the Vietnam War and Asian American studies to the eventual issue of settler colonialism and Vietnamese settler colonialism here and in Vietnam had to come about with an engagement with indigenous studies, which was far afield from what I was doing when I first started off. And then finally, as a professor, I have to say that a lot of my thinking has been changed and encouraged by the work of graduate students. I'm lucky to be at USC. We have a strong American Studies and Ethnicity doctoral program. We bring in students who are somewhat like us, but oftentimes not like us. I'm talking about the faculty. They're doing kinds of work, research work, political work, activist work that are marked by generational differences, but also by differences in what kinds of intellectual and political engagements they're having. So while in scholarship and in teaching, oftentimes, of course, we think of the relationship as the professors teaching students, at least in my experience, it's oftentimes the other way around. Also, I mean, it's a complementary dialogical relationship, and we have to be open to seeing what younger generations of scholars and students are doing.
Okay. I'm going to respond to the question by Xiomara Cervantes Gomez, and a little bit of Leticia Terrones' question as well. I actually came to this idea of the ever more brutal social forms of contemporary capitalism by looking at El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. In those countries as well, there was, import substitution, industrialization. There was a type of capitalist development in the aftermath of World War II that allowed for a certain standard of living, right? With the onset of neoliberalism and the destruction of subsidies and protections for Mexican farmers, Salvadoran farmers, you get this intense urbanization, and you get out-migration to the United States, you get deportation, you get gangs, etc. This is not just about gangs, however, this is about a type of neoliberal moment that requires, I don't want to say rugged individualism, but a brutal individualism in which you don't care about your neighbor, you don't care about the people next to you, where human beings become commodities, where recruiting a young man to be a gang member so you can send him to extort other families, where that becomes a commodity itself, where helping people cross borders becomes another way that you commodify the human suffering. Okay, that's part of this neoliberal turn in government. It's created this sort of this brutal individualism where we must be willing to do things that are quite brutal in order to survive. And that's the reality for lots of people, not just throughout Latin America, but throughout the world ultimately, okay? And this is what Sayak is talking about, okay? So I'm not saying that the cause is the individual, but the neoliberal restructuring of society has created these types of subjectivities, okay? Now, their relation to eugenics is precisely that eugenics posits that that certain groups are more dominant than others. It's based partly on this idea that the strongest groups will survive and will do whatever they need to do in order to establish their domination. Okay, and that's part of the logic that authoritarian. This is the logic of the ever more brutal social relations that have emerged under neoliberalism. Okay, I have more for that too, but I don't want to get too much into Sayak's work. But I love her work. She's a friend of mine. Now, with respect to the question, Leticia Terrones' question, I think there's a lot of working class people of color that are that we are not reaching. In fact, someone, Andy Lee, for instance, brought up around anti-Blackness in non-POC communities. This is a good example, okay? In the Latino communities, when you're going to do the organizing, okay, when you're doing organizing with university people, with academics, it's different, okay? And I've been an organizer for 30 years. I don't consider myself an organizer anymore, but I've been in the trenches, front room trenches of organizing in many contexts. You go into the communities, and these are not scholars, these are not students doing internships in the hood near campus. These are in the deep barrios, and you're going to do community work, and you start engaging just regular working class Chicanos, Mexican Americans, people who don't use the term Latinx, that's a university term, but if you call them Latinx, they're not going to respond to that. And you begin to work with these folks, you begin to see that they've internalized a lot of the dominant discourses that, for instance, here in Southern California, there's a lot of tension on the streets, not in academia, but on the streets around the question of Blacks and Mexican, Latino street vendors. And no academic will touch this topic, but the rappers, the hip hop artists, they're responding to this. The people in the community, they're bringing it up. And these are issues that they want to talk about. And part of our role as intellectuals is to engage the common sense concerns of people in the communities and begin to talk to them and hear their concerns about these things. But if we tell them, hey, you're against the mandate, therefore you're a right-wing Trump supporter, and I'm not going to talk to you, or I'm going to block you, or you're concerned about the violence between Black youth and Latino street vendors, you're anti-Black, I'm going to shut you out. If we do that with everyone in the community, then we're only going to be organizing and talking to a bunch of university students and academics. So, when you're actually on the ground doing that type of work, it gets really messy and it's very difficult to do.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to that as well. I'm coming to you from home and in a place where nobody's wearing masks anymore, or haven't. I don't know if they ever did. It's a place where there's just like a lot of everybody's vaccinated, but they're not wearing masks. I think there's all different kinds of ways that this is taking place all across, and it baffles me. A lot of it baffles me, but I think it's a lot of misinformation, honestly, and that's the hard part with this. What I do like is that the way that there are like communities of care, I hate to go back to that, but Native nations in certain states, right? They were the source of vaccination, not just for their tribal members, but for everybody around them because of the rate that happened. And if anybody, has the right to distrust the US government with their medical system, if you've ever been to an IHS hospital, it is Indians, right? Like it's not good. I still have trouble going to the dentist because I was always last in line because, anyway, that's a different story, but the medical care and the problems with that. So I think when we kind of try to talk to people on the ground, like since I've been home, like I just fought with my mother the other day about the police, these are just, she worked in the paper mill for 25 years. I think there's these different on the ground sort of elements of, you don't have to be organizing to talk to working class people. I think anywhere you go across the United States right now, that there's like a lot of different ways people are taking these mandates. So with that, I don't have any answers to that question. It just baffles me all around. Anti-vaxxers baffle me too. Those are some of the most elite people, are the ones that don't want to also vaccinate their kid, right? And that's coupled with the truckers in Ottawa that the question asked about, right? So my own sister-in-law baffles me. But so anyway, we all have these particular family members, I'm imagining. But I did want to speak a little bit to rugged individualism and the concept of property and how that manifests itself. And that can be part of what Eileen Morton Robinson talks about as the white possessive. You don't have to be white to have that white possessive or have that investment in property also. But in many ways, that also, as the scarcity and access to that becomes less and less, I do see there being this kind of more conflict and division around that because of, when we think, I guess one of the questions that arose to me is, have we ever been out of the eugenics moment? Because as American Indian, I would say no to that, because we were expected to disappear. I'm writing a piece right now called Indians as Graffiti, because we were that which is meant to disappear. Leanne Simpson has a beautiful poem about that, right? But we didn't. Settler colonialism didn't win. We're still here. We still have our sovereign nations. We still have our cultural traditions, and we still have our relationships to land, which we were meant to be alienated from, as well as anybody who came to the US was meant to be alienated from and become into a white possessive logics framework of property. So when I think of the eugenics movement, I think of it as part of that processes of alienation and race making that occurs, right? Like, I love that there's all these I'm on the search committee now, and I get to read these wonderful pieces by Black ecologists right now, and I'm learning a lot, and I think it's wonderful. I love all the Black geographers coming out and Indigenous geographers to talk about that placemaking, because I really do feel like those are the areas where getting outside of that rugged individualism, based on these kind of property logics that, KC Park has a wonderful piece on how property as it's conceived now only came into being because of enslavement and colonization, right? That's when it comes into being in the closing of the commons in Europe. So I really think that needs to be part of really addressing how we can organize in terms of relationality, how we can move past and kind of obscure those sorts of individual property possessive logics as well.
If I could just add something on the relationality issue, I mean, I think it's so important what the various forms of relationality you've been talking about. But I will also say, and also with solidarity too, but I will also say that one of the things about solidarity and relationality that I think about is that it's not only positive, that is, that we seek to build relationships of solidarity with like-minded groups and so on, and alliances, but sometimes it's necessary to have a negative relationship, for me, a negative relationship in terms of solidarity and relations. Like, I want to cut off certain kinds of people For example, just because I'm Vietnamese and you're Vietnamese doesn't mean we're friends. It does not mean we're friends. Oftentimes, when we talk about the various things like rugged individualism, anti-Blackness, investments in property, and so on and so forth, a lot of Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese Americans are completely down for these kinds of things, and they're invested in transforming their refugee experience into this American dream immigrant experience that is an investment in the various versions of settler colonialism and racial capitalism that we've been talking about. They're not my friends. They're not the people who I identify with in terms of solidarity. So sometimes it's necessary to be able to cut off relationships. And that can be a harsh moment. It's a difficult moment for a lot of people, for me to get to, because you do hear a lot of cries out there from people saying, well, we want to be able to educate our community about anti-Blackness, for example. And we should obviously do our best, but there are certain moments when that education is not going to work. And then we have to make political decisions about affiliation and relations.
Alfonso, did you want to respond to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I never said eugenics went away, okay? After World War II, there was a mainstream shying away from eugenics, a distancing from eugenics because of the Nazis, right? But there was forced sterilization of Mexican American women and Native American women throughout that period. To say that during, in the 20th century, post-World War II, Fordist era, that there wasn't oppression, there was the Bracero program. No, all that stuff existed, but it was a different moment. And the moment right now is one where they don't even shy away from eugenics. Where eugenics was the eugenicists were in the White House, where this makes a mainstream comeback and becomes one of the dominant mainstream ideological forces in society. For me, that's a reflection of the moment that we're in. It's a reflection of the moment that we're in. And with respect to cutting people off, I personally don't cut people off, so easily. I've cut some people off, but with the communities, and I do a lot of community work. We have to meet people where they're at and work with their common sense. It's in their common sense. Their common sense is contradictory. It has elements of good sense, so they're right on. Like, for instance, you ask the average homeboy on the streets of Southern California, well, this used to be Mexico, and they're like, yeah, this used to be Mexico. They know that, okay? But because of the California prison system, because of the evolution of gang politics, there's tension between Blacks and Latinos on the streets, not in academia, but on the streets, okay? So when you're working with young Latinos, for instance, in the barrios, in the communities, right, you're gonna get elements of that. Now, do you educate them? Do you work to build a critical consciousness? For instance, one of the things that we're doing is that we're building we're doing political education in the communities here in neighborhoods where there is gangs, where there is young Chicanos, Mexican Americans that are influenced by the street politics and by the prison politics. So we engage them. We can't just cut them off, because when we cut them off, what happens? They get absorbed into the real right wing, the right wing that's, for instance, there is an entire right wing movement that is trying to organize Latinos to leave the Democratic Party. I'm not a defender of the Democratic Party, right? But I'm also not a Republican, obviously, right? So I don't think we can abandon large sectors of our community because they question mass, because they don't think like a PhD student in American studies. If we do that, then we're going to be a very small group of intellectuals dealing with a very authoritarian society that's organized our communities against us.
So let me in our final few minutes, let me run through some really abbreviated questions, because there's 3 or 4 here, and I'll just read through them really quickly. So from Andy Lee, I think we've addressed some of these things, but if we want to go one more round and have some quick bites on them. How do we address anti-Blackness in non-Black POC communities? Some of that stuff's been addressed in terms of thinking about critique. This is coming from Hiroko Tumono. How can we support and empower the K through 12 teachers who are trying to teach important global history and help their students develop critical thinking skills when parents and politicians are increasingly vocal about, and this is, I guess, a CRT kind of question. What are not to teach our future generation? Another question regarding the very definition of race. Who gets to define it? How is it determined? What is racism in the very first place? And then a final question. Let's see. Well, perhaps we can just start there, because we have just a few minutes left. If folks want to jump in, address other things we haven't addressed. I do also think that there's an important conversation that we're having in terms of thinking about where do we put conservatism in our radical movements? How do we deal with conservatives in the struggle? And particularly as we're thinking about relationality, what does that look like? Anyone want to jump in?
I would say there's not just a problem with conservatism, there's a problem with liberalism as well.
Exactly.
And so I don't like actually putting things in those like kind of categories. I find it both equal, like problematic in the stances of one's asking for absorption into this kind of what I call the violence of inclusion, right? And that violence of inclusion, which can erode certain particularities, not just in Indigenous studies. I think of this for everyone. Sometimes I think about it in kind of some of the debates around are Black people settlers or are other people who are forced here settlers? And I've asked this question previously in relation to that. It's like this whole nobody's tearing apart nation of immigrants. I'd be pissed if I was Black and the nation of immigrants story was what I had to also ingest in the K through, I'm going to try to tie it to K through 12. So when I was, I got kicked out of first grade because I wouldn't pledge allegiance to the flag, because that's how we're taught not to do that, because that's a different country and da da da. So I think there's a way that it manifested within a lot of Indigenous thought is that the violence of inclusion under American was also about absorption of our lands, right? And then absorption into a racial category, which is undermining our power. But then I wonder, I've been in wonderful talks. I'm very fortunate to have been in talks with Cheryl Harris and some wonderful Black scholars like Sarah Haley, et cetera, and trying to like really, work out these kind of those kind of tensions also, and how liberalism can be equally as damaging to people of color as conservatism is. It's the same coin. It's a coin I don't necessarily want, right? If we're talking about kind of racialized capitalism and how it operates, it doesn't just operate through this like massive capitalist moment, right? Like I understand totally what you were saying, Alfonso. I mean, when Trump stood under that Andrew Jackson photo while he was talking to the code talkers. Oh, so much to analyze there. So much problematic about imperialism, settler colonialism, racism, eugenics, and eradication of Native, just so much. And I think, but I think about that moment and how then it was portrayed, right, by the supposed liberal media, and that was equally as problematic. I just wanted to toss the whole coin away, so to speak. So I think sometimes we have to be critical, with that self-critical also, and really begin to think of that as not a binary.
Just I'm going to have to leave in a second to go pick up my kids from school, but I want to just make this last point. Capitalism is changing. The demographics are changing as whites don't reproduce their families at the same rate that they did during the Fordist era. The nature of the market is changing, right? And a lot of the white resentment for the way things are moving is ultimately misguided anger about the changing political economy in many ways. But with the shift in capitalism, our identities are also becoming commodities. And there's an entire marketing infrastructure around Latinos and Asians and corporations. Just go to a Dodgers game, just go to Disneyland, and you see the corporate capital is already figured out. We don't need whiteness the way it was configured in the 20th century in order for the reproduction of capitalism. We just need to diversify the corporate field. I mean, this is why you have diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, not just at every major university now, but in every major corporation. And as capitalism changes, and it's found a way to commodify our identities, if we don't have a critique of capital, we too, even if we consider ourselves on the left, will also end up commodifying our identities without providing a critique of capitalism and thinking of an alternative. We can have all Latino politicians here in California. We can have all Latino deans and chancellors in the university systems, but that doesn't change the system of exploitation of labor. It doesn't change the very logic of capital accumulation. And they will continue to incorporate most of us into the body politic in a way that supports an imperial project abroad. And then that's where I'm shifting my intellectual energies to. Not to say that race doesn't matter, it's just mattering in a different way. Mm-hmm. And that capitalism is for me, something that we've really understudied in ethnic studies and American studies. I mean, I've heard colleagues say, we don't need to study Marx because we're ethnic studies and we only study other people of color. Well, I'm sorry, we don't live in a world with just people of color. We live in a social world that was produced by capitalism in modernity.
I think we are at time, so we should definitely stop now. Thank you all very much for joining us for this conversation. Thank you also to everyone in the audience for their questions. So thank you.